Hey, welcome back. It's Carrie again with another episode of Gardenside Chat. Welcome back to my garden. Today we're going to talk about kind of mid-season tomato care. So we did one earlier about transplanting tomatoes, and then my coworker Tony did one kind of more like wide-ranging, all about tomatoes and general care and stuff. And today we're going to focus on tomatoes again and just do some real specific care tips, things to be looking for right now with your tomato plants and that kind of thing. So let's get started. So here are some of my tomato plants, and these tomato plants are the exact same ones that I started way back in March for a really early Gardenside Chat. I think about starting seeds in your house. So all of the tomatoes I'm growing, I've got 14, are from that workshop. So this is where they are now. So you've seen them through their lives. So they're doing really well. So just to back up really quick, what I did when I transplanted them is I weeded everything, although the weeds are coming back, obviously. Weeded everything. They were really tall by the time, maybe a little too tall, but they were like this tall by the time I planted them. And so what I did was I took them out of the pot, I pinched off the lower leaves, and I buried them so only about like this much was sticking out of the ground. And that way it facilitates a deeper root development, and the deeper the roots, the more water they get on their own, the more like rooted, like literally, I guess, rooted in the ground they are, like structurally it's important. So I buried them really deep, and then I added some organic general all-purpose fertilizer, and then a specific organic tomato and pepper base, well, not base, but it's a specific fertilizer for tomato, peppers, and eggplants that like complements the general all-purpose fertilizer I used. So I did fertilize them. I personally, as a gardener, struggled for years not fertilizing because in my mind I was like, well, if you just add compost and do all these like organic methods to gardening, like that should be enough. And that does go a really long way. But if you think about it, a vegetable garden is so intensive. You're taking so much out of the ground all the time. You just want to eat everything that's coming out of the ground. Well, even if you add compost and mulch and stuff, that's not replenishing all of those nutrients that those plants took out of the ground to create the vegetables. So it is important to fertilize regardless if you're organic or not practicing all organic principles. Either way, you should fertilize your garden, and there's plenty of really great organic fertilizers that you can purchase. We purchase ours in bulk from Wisconsin, so it's unfortunately not a great locally, a great fertilizer that's locally available, but Westlake sells Garden Tone, which has organic general fertilizers and also organic tomato fertilizers. You can also get them from Amazon. There's a whole world of organic fertilizers. So it's important. That is to say, it's important to fertilize, and tomatoes are what we call heavy eaters. So, and any fruit-producing plant is kind of generally a heavy feeder because it takes so much for the plant to produce these fruits. So fertilizing them is important. Fertilizing them with specific things for the plant is important. So like a tomato fertilizer is important because it'll have the right nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium ratio and all that stuff. So they're fertilized, which is why they look so nice and green. Just a couple weeks ago, they were only about this tall. And I remember thinking like the week before last week, like, oh, I can't wait till they get up to this third like square. And now they're all the way up here. And a couple of them are like just a couple squares away from going over the cage. So cages or trellises or stakes are really important for tomatoes. And if you haven't done that yet with your tomatoes, it's really important to do it like as soon as possible because they don't really vine, but they don't really like have the structure to hold themselves up off the ground. So we kind of, here in the Midwest, we need to give that support to them so that they can be hoisted up off the ground. And I say the sooner the better because if your tomatoes kind of like laying on the ground, it it's going to be hard. It's going to start growing in that way, and it's going to be hard to like hoist that tomato up and trellis it or cage it without some limbs breaking and stuff. If we could actually go over here for 1 second, I can kind of show you what I mean. So here's another tomato that is ultimately going to be tied to this trellis right here, but it's not yet. So you can see that it's starting to kind of grow along the ground. So when you lift it up, you can kind of see how it's growing this way now instead of that way. And you know, the tomato will bounce back from that, but it's just a little more delicate to wait to this stage to like trellis it. Also, these hairs will turn into roots with contact from the ground. So if it's laying on the ground too much, it will actually root into the ground like that, which in places like California is totally fine in how they grow them. But here we're a little too humid. There's a lot of soil-borne like diseases that tomatoes get. So that's why we try to keep most of the plant not touching the ground. So anyway, let's go back over here to these caged ones. So that's why when I planted my tomatoes, like the next couple days later, I came back with these cages. So my tomatoes are what's called indeterminate tomatoes. There's two general categories of tomatoes. There's indeterminate and determinate. Indeterminate means they'll just keep getting taller and taller and longer and just keep producing tomatoes until the season kills them. Determinate means they grow to a certain height, and then once they hit that certain height, they'll like throw out all of the tomatoes they're gonna make within like a 2-week span, and then more or less they're done. So they're generally shorter. The main difference is determinants don't need to be like trellised as much as indeterminates, and it's for like a really concentrated harvest. So if you're trying to can a whole bunch, in past years I've grown all determinants because I was really into like sauce making for a couple years, and I wanted everything to come in a 2-week span so I could like make all my canning stuff. Versus this year where I'm doing indeterminates because I've got a lot going on in my life, and I thought, yeah, just like tomatoes for sandwiches and freezing and stuff over the course of the whole summer would be kind of more where I'm at. So these are indeterminates, which means they're going to get super tall if they're happy, and I hope they're happy. So they're going to get as tall as the cage, and then they're just going to keep growing. So what they're going to do is they're going to start flopping over the sides of the cage and start kind of growing down, but like the tips are going to kind of swoop up. So by the end of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if the actual end of the tomato plant was down here, but you know, had all of this like cascading plant matter coming over the side. So it's going to be kind of like a mess by the end of the summer, because that's just how they grow. But that's why you really want your cage or your stake or your trellis, whatever, to be really secure in the ground, because this is it's stuck in the ground with the, you know, the ends of these like metal pieces. But if this tomato gets really big, it could just pull it out of the ground, and that's a whole issue. But anyway, so you want it really steady. You don't want to just set it on the ground. It's got to be staked in or somehow affixed very well to the ground.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
On the screen.
Yeah.
So what if plants have a yellow tinge to them? Not enough water, needs fertilizer? So she's curious.
Yeah, great question. We have a question about if there's a yellow tinge to the tomato. And there's a few different things that could happen, but generally yellow tinge indicates nitrogen deficiency. So if you haven't fertilized, I would put some fertilizer on it. You want it to be a balanced fertilizer. You do not just want to put something with all nitrogen, because that will make the plant like super beautiful and dark green and way leafy. But in order to oversimplify things, in order to make flowers and then fruit, you need phosphorus and potassium as well. So you might get more vegetative growth and not a whole bunch of like flower and fruit. So you want it to be a balanced fertilizer, but nitrogen, yes.
Okay.
And if you have already fertilized and you're still seeing that, another thought is it could be a little wet. So it's been super wet, everyone knows. And sometimes when like the ground's really wet, the plants can't get oxygen through their roots, and it just like stresses them out. And so sometimes they can get a little yellow. But I would imagine it's probably the fertilizer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, so actually I was going to talk about water. So we kind of talked, it's been really wet, and tomatoes really don't need a ton of water. Usually, like what real serious gardeners and farmers will do is they'll water them kind of to get the tomatoes established, like the first few weeks, and then some like hardcore people won't water them the rest of the year, which means the tomato plant itself in most years like looks terrible. It's like so wilty during the day and just looks bad. But what happens is the fruit there's less water content in the fruit, so the fruit is actually more flavorful. But at any rate, if you do water your tomatoes, you don't want to like stand here with the hose like watering on the foliage and stuff, because it's so humid here already. The tomatoes don't really love humidity to begin with. You don't want to just keep them real wet on their leaves. So I get the hose. I don't have a hose on me, but then I stick it right to the ground. So you kind of reduce the soil splashback and water splashback on the leaves. So you just kind of hold it right to the ground. And then if you want and need to water your tomatoes, do it consistently, because especially once there's fruit on the plants, if you wait weeks and then you're like, oh, I need to water my tomatoes, and you water them a whole bunch, what's going to happen is the fruit's going to split, which, maybe isn't a huge problem, but like if you want beautiful tomatoes and you don't want them to split, you need to water consistently, because that's where those cracks come from. Is all of a sudden the plant didn't have moisture, and then all of a sudden it had a whole bunch, and the fruit grew immensely, but faster than the skin could grow, and that's why it cracks.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
Is it 20-20-20 fertilizer good?
Oh, good question. Is a 20-20-20 fertilizer good? Honestly, I can't answer that question off the top of my head, but what I can do is we can share the NPK rates from the tomato fertilizer we use at work after we're finished, and because I have some at my house, we can share that through the comments. Yeah. Okay. So if you water consistently, they don't need a ton of water. So this is the next thing I want to talk about is pruning. So if you're real into your tomatoes, you can prune them, and there's definitely specific ways to do this, and there's definitely specific timing to do that. So why do you prune? You prune because not all branches of indeterminate tomatoes, and you only want to prune indeterminate tomatoes, which is worth saying is most of the tomatoes people grow. You only want to prune indeterminate tomatoes, and you can prune them if you choose to, because not all branches will produce flowers and thus produce fruit. So the thinking is, if you kind of thin out those branches that don't produce fruit, you kind of increase the air circulation around the plant, reduce fungal infections, and then like the plant's not like actively trying to grow this branch that selfishly isn't going to do anything for you. So and you don't need any tools to prune, you just need your fingers. And that's important because you don't want to prune branches if the branches are too big, because you don't really want a huge open wound on a tomato, because as I've said multiple times, they're just really prone to infection. Like these look really good now. I wouldn't be surprised if the next time we do a tomato workshop, they look really like yellowed and spotty, but then there'll be a whole series of conversations. It'll be great. Okay, so we're going to kind of zoom in on this particular little guy, and we're going to look right, can you see that? Right here. So here's a branch right here, and then like in this armpit, there's another little baby branch popping out. Perfect. So this is what we call a sucker, and this is the branch that's not going to produce any flowers and thus fruit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that little sucker branch, and I'm just going to like pop it off, and it just kind of like pulls right off. Super easy. Done. Now, if we can kind of rotate over here, there's another sucker. So now I missed this sucker. Boom. So here's the branch that's going to produce fruit, and then here's another branch. This one's too big. So the kind of rule of thumb is if you can easily pinch it off with your fingers, it's good. If it's too big to easily pinch off with your fingers, what's going to happen is if I pinch this off, it'll probably like rip a little bit down here. So you just want to you don't want to cause that much like damage. So I'm just going to leave this one. It's not the end of the world. Honestly, most years I don't even prune the suckers. I have already done it once this year though, just, for fun. I have missed a few, but here at the top is another real tiny one, and you want to get them the smaller the better. So here's one. So again, I'm just going to take my thumb and kind of just like, boom, there it goes. And then I just like toss that on the ground.
Is this the time you would do that?
Yeah. So you want them real small. They'll kind of like continue growing them all throughout their life. So, the plant gets so bushy at some point that it's just like, you just can't keep up. But when they're still kind of small and compact, you can kind of like open them up through pruning for some more air circulation, which is like kind of the whole key to the game. Is like, you want air circulation around them, you want them off the ground so they're not touching the ground and getting wet. So that's kind of pruning in a nutshell. On each plant,